Good afternoon and welcome to the next of our webinars in the Economics of Healthy Aging series. And today we're going to be considering the question, is the politics of aging creating conflict between the generations? We have our speakers today are Scott Greer from the University of Michigan and also the Observatory, and Jennifer Dixon from the Health Foundation, and Jane Gingrich from the University of Oxford. Unfortunately, Julia Lynch is not able to be with us today, but Scott has very kindly agreed to see his way to presenting her slides, and so we'll be following the format that we've originally agreed. Now, the Economics of Healthy Aging series is about trying to dispel some of the myths about the effects of aging on the population health and on the viability of health systems. There are some popular ideas that somehow population aging, which has been a great success of public health, is also going to be a great challenge in terms of financing and delivery of health and social care. What we are trying to do in this series is to get an understanding of what the effects will be and dispel some of the myths around the effects of aging on the health systems and on our ability to provide excellent support and care for people in later life. So at this stage, I'm going to hand over to Erica, who's going to give us the basis for doing a short poll that we will then be using as part of the management of this webinar. So Erica, if you could just take us forward on this.
Thank you very much, Charles. And Annalisa, if you could launch the poll. Yes, this is just, we wanted to see where we were at the moment because this is such a diverse audience. So just a couple of quick questions for you. The first question is, in your country, is there an intergenerational conflict over public spending priorities? That's a simple yes/no question. But then also going a bit deeper, you know, what do we think drives policy making in this area? And multiple choice question, multiple answers allowed. But is it that older voters are the priority for politicians? Is it that providing care to an aging population is financially unsustainable? Is it the need to prioritize spending on future generations? Distributing resources based on need, regardless of age? Is there just no money for anything so that everyone suffers? Or is it actually none of the above? So we're really interested to hear where you are in your countries at the moment, and we'll give the results of the poll after Scott's overview. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica. And if people can fill in the poll, then we're going to have a better set of results if we get a more representative population to look at. We're all good scientists here, so we hope you're all going to contribute to the good science that we're doing. So our first speaker is Scott Greer from the University of Michigan. He's going to be talking a little bit about the myths and some of the popular misconceptions around the effects of aging and the way in which this leads to intergenerational conflict. So over to you, Scott.
What I'm going to be presenting is by no means only my work. This is work of a fairly large team that put together and produced a book that was published just recently on the politics of healthy aging. And that's a big team where Julie, who can't be with us, Jane and I were all participants along with Aaron Reeve, Michelle Falkenbach, Claire Bambra. So I'm not taking credit for all of the things that we said here, but we were convinced by the book. And the problem that we took on was understanding kind of the common argument that basically older people are endangering the sustainability of not just necessarily the healthcare system as a whole, but arguably a lot of social policy and investment in future generations through the simple mechanism of, in democracies, outvoting everybody else. So the third slide, which when we get back into slideshow, I'm not quite sure what's going on. There's the IMF famously, for example, yes, showed the last train for pension reform departs in. And that little blue graph on the right side of the screen is showing a very simple calculation of the sort that economists might make, where they say, at what point will more than half of the population be elderly, be older people, and therefore be voting for their benefits aimed at their generation at the expense of other people? Now that requires two different assumptions, right? The first is that older people make extra demands on healthcare systems. You've heard it so many times, an aging society is expensive and creates new healthcare needs. You've also got the second argument, which is that older people constitute an interest group. And this is where political scientists like us get interested. They're going to demand better benefits from themselves, from politicians, at the expense of other generations. The burden of today's seminar and much of the series is that no, that's not true. There never was a train. It's never going to leave. Next slide, please. So this is actually reproduced from kind of the foundational 2019 work on the impact of population aging on the welfare state. And it shows the extent to which there might be a necessary negative impact on the sustainability of healthcare systems in aging societies. And it shows in different countries, what is the likely contribution of change in the population age profile to health expenditures over about 70 years. What you see is simply that it goes down and that the vertical axis has fairly small numbers. So if your healthcare system can't handle a 1.5% change in expenditure over 60 years, I think you have a larger problem than simply you have a larger problem than aging. You have some sort of a significant policy problem. Furthermore, that's taking a narrow accounting view and saying what is going to be the cost consequences of change in age profile. But it's not paying attention to all the other work that we don't necessarily count well. Older people who are in unpaid work, for example, looking after grandchildren, as well as paid workers, which is made possible if they're in good health. Next slide, please. So the next point is that aging is not the same in different countries. So there's a very common kind of rhetoric about how there's a lot of older people buying themselves a nice time in Mallorca with expensive public pensions. That's very, very Western Europe focused. So in Central and Eastern European countries, we often see relative poverty among older people. The graph there is showing the percent of old people who report they're able to make ends meet. 10% in Greece, Bulgaria, 20% in Latvia. So 9 out of 10 Bulgarian older people report having trouble making ends meet. 90% of Danish or Luxembourg people say they're fine. So this is already a story of significant difference between countries. Furthermore, even within Western Europe, older people aren't necessarily rich. There's in some Western European countries, and they're quite diverse, but for example, Italy, you have a great deal of inequality between older people. You have significant poverty among older people. And at the same time, you have famously expensive and inegalitarian pension policies. For most of the rest of the slides, we're going to be focused on Western Europe because that's the set of countries where we most hear about a generational divide where older people are grabbing more than they deserve. But I want to highlight that there's a lot of diversity in the politics of aging in different countries. And a lot of this is due not to demographics or human greed or human niceness, but simply politics and policy. Next slide, please. So here's the argument. And it's a bit of a thought experiment. First of all, remember that we might be paying attention to the money that's being spent from public systems to older people, but pension, it runs in both ways, right? We can easily track pension or health expenditures, but we also all know, think about families you know, parents help children with money, with childcare, they bequeath things. Logically, parents with more money and parents in better health, and they go together, can do more for their children. So to the extent that you cut back public financing, all you're doing is transmitting more of the basic inequalities of wealth. More reliance on public finance allows families to manage problems more equally. More reliance on private finance for healthcare or social care simply means that richer people can buy themselves a better situation. The implication is that the inequalities that matter in everything else in public health also matter here. What is the caring workforce? They are often people who don't have stable citizenship rights, or they're a different race. And overwhelmingly, both the paid and the unpaid caring workforce are made up of women. So there's a lot of inequalities there. And if we try to drive down the cost of long-term care, it'll often be borne by those people. Then there's basic health and wealth entering old age. A lot of the countries with the most poisonous intergenerational politics also have the most inequality among older people. And those are inequalities that are driven by income, race, citizenship, or gender. And finally, it bears repeating that not everybody gets to be old. It's simple enough that there is an impact on longevity and healthy life years from your social class. Next slide, please. Therefore, this slide should not be too much of a surprise. Essentially, on the horizontal axis, it's the percent of older people say it's fairly easy to make ends meet. And on the vertical axis is the Gini co-index of inequality. It's not an enormous effect, but as a policymaker, if you could have that much of an effect, you would be able to call it a good day's work. And what it simply shows is that more equal rich countries tend to have more financially secure older people, because people who were better off, or at least more equal earlier in life, are better off or at least more equal later in life. So what I think this shows is that a lot of the time looking at intergenerational inequalities, older people versus younger people, is obscuring much more important things and much more classic political issues, such as the politics of income distribution, the politics of wealth distribution, inheritance, housing markets, the politics of gender, because women do so much of the formal and informal caring, and so forth. All the old inequalities we know so well in health politics and policy. So thank you.
Thank you, Scott. We'll have a lot of opportunities to discuss the points raised in this presentation and the other ones. If people can put questions into the chat, then we'll be able to pick them up later on and introduce them into the panel discussion we'll be having later on. At this stage, though, can I ask that Erica presents us with the results from the poll, so we'll have some idea of what our starting points are. So over to you, Erica.
Thank you very much, Charles. And Elisa, if you could launch the poll results. Well, interestingly, very, very clear that there is intergenerational conflict over public spending priorities in the majority of the countries as represented in this audience, and that the big drivers of policy making in this area are that older voters are the priority for politicians, and that providing care to an aging population is seen as financially unsustainable. But interestingly, all of these points were actually seen by quite a large proportion of people as being part of the background to why aging is creating conflict between generations. So very interesting food for thought there, and maybe in the discussion we'll be able to clarify some of these issues. Back to you, Charles. Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. And one of the things we can perhaps hope to do during the panel discussion at the end is to look a little bit more detail at some of the myths and some of the realities around what will be the effects of the population aging on the health systems. But at this stage, we're going to go back to Scott Greer, who this time is pretending to be Julie, and we'll be talking about older people and self-interest and what is the evidence around that.
So I'm going to pretend to be Julie and break down the basic argument that I think a lot of you have seen and experienced, which is that older people essentially demand a better welfare state for themselves, and politicians deliver it. First of all, let's approach this sort of thinking about the logic of the argument. So the first assumption is that social welfare goods are zero sum, that €1 spent on looking after grandma is €1 not spent on looking after the child. This is not necessarily the case, right? Because €1 spent making grandma healthier might enable grandma to look after the child and thereby enable the parents to participate in paid labor. Furthermore, even to the extent that they are zero-sum, there's a lot of a natural aging society. You need more geriatricians, but you need fewer obstetricians, so to speak. You might need more old folks' homes, but you need fewer schools. So even if they are zero-sum, it's not clear that you come out net worse as a society. The second assumption is that the preferences of older voters drown out those of younger voters, and that older voters are interested in voting for a better welfare state for themselves. It's not entirely clear that the electoral behavior of older voters bears this assumption out, because a lot of them are voting, as many of us do, for very pro-social reasons. So there's a very bitter conversation in Britain about whether Brexit was primarily older people self-indulgently voting away their children's futures. Well, if you ask them, they think they're voting for a better future for their children. They've tried the European Union, they didn't like it, and their children will be better off outside it. Putting aside your view of Brexit, that's a perfectly pro-social argument that you're doing the right thing for the future. Then the third assumption is that politicians are more attentive to the elderly because they're numerous in an aging society and because they vote. There's variation between countries, but in most countries, older people are more likely to turn out at the elections. Next, thank you. So here we have a version of the actual experience of the IMF's train argument that when 50% of the population is over 55, the time for pension reform is gone, you're a gerontocracy. And here we have most of these countries have 55 plus share of voters in the national electorate. So you'd say that most of the European Union is condemned to gerontocracy if you follow this argument, that you'll see older voters buying themselves a better and better welfare state at the expense of their children. But is that how politics works? The 50% threshold is only meaningful if we imagine that countries are single member districts, which is the case in very few places. There's a lot of variation in whether older voters are the voters that politicians actually need to pay attention to. There's their share in the overall electorate, but there's their geographic distribution. So for example, London is a far younger city. Paris is a far younger city than a lot of the rural areas around them. How do electoral systems reflect that? And there is the electoral system. Where do they live? And what parties are available for them to vote for? And how does that translate into seats? Politicians can be absolutely ruthless at deciding who needs their attention. And they're going to pay attention to things like what are the likelihood that elderly voters actually are capable of changing their political futures. And there's a lot of variability in that. Next slide, please. So then the question is, do older people demand what's good for only them, right? Because if they demand, I don't know, walkable, pedestrianized cities, maybe everybody benefits from that. If you have low floor buses, people with baby carriages benefit as well as people with walkers. Well, here's the answer. Older people do vote more. They do have some distinctive social policy preferences, and they sometimes vote on the basis of those preferences, which are typically for good pensions. But a lot of issues, older and younger voters have substantially similar social policy preferences. And there's a lot of countries in Western Europe in particular, where the social policy preferences are very similar between generations. So older people will frequently want good schools for their grandchildren. Not always, but they often are invested in particular concrete grandchildren as well as a concept of the future. They don't vote as a bloc. Party identities that were shaped over your entire life don't necessarily change when you become 55 or 65. If you were a social democrat when you're younger, you don't necessarily switch over to becoming a Christian Democrat because you're 55 and want a different pension. And that's partly because they don't vote primarily on issues of concern to older people. There aren't that many powerful political issues in most Western European countries where there's a big age divide. The outliers are the US and the UK, where you see very pronounced generational effects. But I would point out that these are also countries where a lot of other things are happening. In the UK, the spike in secondary education means that younger people and older people have very different educational profiles. And in the United States, there's been an enormous demographic change, which means that you're also looking at the classic American issue of racial politics when you look at generational divides. The US is a much less white country. Next slide, please. So if older people voting themselves a lovely welfare state doesn't drive policy, what does? Well, politicians, first of all, will often over and undersupply policies. A lot of the time it's a response to providers, right? So if the healthcare system wants more money and wants aging to be the argument for more healthcare expenditure, you'll get that. Or people who want to spend less on public health care, who want to privatize more provision, will often say that therefore that aging is a reason that welfare states are unsustainable. This is a political argument. Most rich countries can do a lot of things, and frequently politicians provide more or less than the voters actually seem to want. Then there's the nature of political competition. Are the parties actually competing in concrete areas for the votes of older people? Do they necessarily have to care? Because, for example, Green parties are frequently much less attractive to older voters. That probably shapes what Green parties care about when they compete. Then the next problem is simple policy drift, the failure to update policies to new realities. So, for example, healthy aging is a nice example of something that leads to a lot of older people who are quite engaged in the labor market with fairly cheap, low-intensity chronic problems that are easy enough to manage if your healthcare system is set up for it. And then finally, in the current period, particularly in the Eurozone, a lot of the time politicians are particularly driven by real or perceived fiscal constraints. So a lot of what they're thinking about in aging is very simply ways to manage pension liabilities. And that's putting aside the politics of Eurozone and budgetary constraint and bond markets. They still have a lot of latitude. The question is what they politically think they can cut. Next slide, please. So what should we pay attention to? First of all, your overall welfare state can create pressure to cater to older voters. If you have a less generous welfare state, the voters have more intensity of mobilization once they depend on those pensions. Furthermore, asset-based welfare, which above all means the country is driven by house prices, but also stock market investments, create more incentives to hoard resources. Specific electoral coalitions create incentives for politicians to cater to older voters. So, for example, if you're in an area with heavy representation of rural voters who are often older in Europe, that's going to create a different dynamic than if you have a more proportional representative system that typically represents younger urban areas better. And finally, older people aren't all alike. I began, back before I was Julie, talking about how there's a lot of inequalities that shape us and don't go away when you turn 55 or 65. And so inequality among older people affects their propensity to vote. It also affects the extent to which their demands are reasonable versus something that we could argue are greedy. Next slide, please. That will be Jane. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott, and thanks particularly for taking on these twin roles in this. And just to remind you, I see some very interesting questions coming in the chat. If you keep asking them, we'll be able to put these together and have that as a basis for some of our discussion later on. Scott mentioned that the UK and the US are outliers, but also there's huge variation. And I just point out that the next speaker will be talking about England, not about the UK, although there are obviously some aspects that are the same. But we thought it'd be useful to have an insight from a particular country looking at the way in which the politics of aging works out in terms of the potential competition for resources. So Jennifer Dixon from the Health Foundation is going to give us some insight into the perspective from the point of view of England. So over to you, Jennifer.
Good. So just a few comments now from England, one or two from the UK, in fact, to give you some colour about what's happening in the UK. So I think all of you know, of course, of the increasing ageing in some societies, and this just gives you some basic figures for the population by age group across the UK. And this is projected by the Office for National Statistics into the future to 2066. And I think what you see is, looking at the dark bars and above, this is the population over 65, and you can see the most rapid growth in that age group relative to others. We also know that there are big differences, as Scott has quite rightly said, between older people and younger people in a number of ways. I think one of the obvious points is that young people have lower assets, and we know that, but they also have lower pay. So this is just one example of median pay by age across the UK actually, and this shows you if you're younger, of course, you don't get paid as much as older people. We know that, and it tails off a bit after 60. We also know that younger people have had less chance to accumulate wealth over time. This is wealth here, and this is age. And over time, depending when you were born, you accumulate wealth throughout your lifetime, and then it tails off. But there is some evidence to show that people in younger age group are accumulating less wealth than people who were that age a few years ago. And that is even despite the fact that some are inheriting some wealth. We also know that younger people have other disadvantages apart from the advantage of youth. They're often concentrated in more fragile sectors of work, hospitality, for example, and many more are on what's called 0 hours contracts in the UK. They are on softer forms of funding, which is more precarious. So there's less wealth, lower income, and more precarious work we know about. We also know that the last 2 years, certainly in the UK, has really aggravated differences across the generations. And nowhere is this probably clearer than in in wealth and housing, because we know that in Britain, at least, the house prices have absolutely shot up. And this is, of course, benefiting the older generation, who may, as Scott quite rightly says, then, of course, bequeath those assets to the young. But at the moment, that wealth accumulation and all that goes with it is happening in the older age group. And you can see this graph shows you pre and post pandemic, the age distribution, with post pandemic being in the turquoise color. With respect to public sector spending, if you look over time in England at the relative expenditure of different parts of public spending, you see that health really has won out compared to other areas of spend that may benefit younger people. So you can see that health is the lion's share, and that graph only goes up to 2016. The health trend has got even higher since then and is over 20% of total managed expenditure across government. So health is winning out. Why is that particularly important for age? Well, just as Scott said, if you look at per capita age spending curves, you see, of course, that more money is spent per capita in older age groups, both for healthcare, but also, of course, for social care as well. That is occurring with more older people with higher spend. You can see how the money adds up to increase the health budget. And governments across the globe are finding it very difficult to exert downward pressure on health spending. They are more successful in Britain at holding down spend for social care. If you look at the distribution of costs and future healthcare costs, this is in the hospital sector now, the acute sector, coming from different elements, and model this. You see that the aging of the population and the different size of the population is only a smaller fraction of total healthcare costs, in total acute care costs in future. The bigger factor is the fact that more people are getting one or more chronic disease. And that is accounting for 50% of the increase in projected increase in acute care costs, that's hospital costs, in the future. So it's not aging per se, it's not population size per se, it is actually the fact that people are getting more and more chronic conditions in the UK, and they are getting them earlier as well. But what is interesting, and this is perhaps a point to be cheerful, is that some of the Health Foundation, my colleagues' recent analysis is showing that while people are collecting more and more chronic disease at an earlier age, this is not translating into limitations of what's called ADL, or activities of daily life. people are managing to stay independent for longer, despite the fact that they are collecting chronic disease. So what this points to is that costs in future may well be more concentrating in healthcare than social care if more and more people are able to both live independently, but also, of course, if their partners are surviving, then they will have a built-in carer and need to depend less on social care. But just going back to other parts of public sector spend, I think Scott referred to this, that over time, certainly in the UK, welfare spending in other ways has benefited pensioners. And what this graph shows you is the income change over time since 2010 at different age groups, the difference in spending per head, I think this is, yes, sorry, weekly average family income, who has lost and who has gained over that period from the public sector purse on welfare. And what you see is that all age groups since 2010, there has been a loss of a relative cut compared to the pensionable age, which has gained. So that's an absolute policy choice right there. We know also, and this is again, Scott has referred to this, that there are differences in when you survey different cohorts of how positive they feel about the future, how more likely are they or not to feel better off than their parents. And what you're seeing here is a clear trend in that younger generations feel that they will be worse off than their parents' generation over time. And this is about 10 years old now, but the same is true today, if not more accentuated. And this is probably translating into attitudes to the welfare state. Again, Scott referred to this, that if you are older, you are more likely to support the welfare state, agree with the creation that the welfare state is one of Britain's proudest achievement. But if you are younger, you're less likely to feel that way. And that sort of sentiment is relevant to today, where on the 1st of April this year, we are facing a tax hike in national insurance, which is not a particularly progressive tax, to pay for the NHS and the National Health Service and its recovery, and to boost funding in social care. And you can see here that richer people and older people are feeling that this is fair, but younger and poorer people are feeling that it's less fair. And that's a very clear message that's coming out of multiple polls. And as we know, voter turnout is much lower in the young compared to the old. These are figures from the 3 recent general elections we've had in Britain. And these are very clear figures. But as also has been said before, it doesn't mean to say that older people just vote for their own issues. They may also vote for their children and their grandchildren's issues, but certainly they are the ones who are turning out at elections. So age is a big deal, as we can see. It's driving policy choices. But meantime, there are other, as has been mentioned, other big related inequalities of the type that Scott mentioned. And nothing is bigger, I think, probably than socioeconomic inequalities. And this map here shows you in England the differences across the country in socioeconomic and on a multiple index of multiple deprivation. And you see the dark spots here being the areas of most deprivation. And then if you look at those are the areas where the economy is often lower, not in the case of London. Productivity is often lower outside of London. Illness is worse, and so on and so forth. So huge inequalities. And this is also, those sorts of patterns are driving health inequalities, which map very closely onto socioeconomic. And this is my second to last slide. And what this shows you is life expectancy here at birth, and this is disability-free life expectancy at birth. And all these little dots are parts of the country that are arranged according to most economically deprived on the left hand and least economically deprived on that side. And what this shows you is the current pensionable age, which is 66 in this country, is occurring after many people have become disabled or have limitations. So this is sort of aggravating the wish by the state to push up the pensionable age, which is another area of quite significant conflict as we go through time. So finally, what am I saying? I am saying the obvious, that there is clearly a growth in the percentage of the population over 65s, and that's accelerating. There are significant inequalities, we know this, across society, not just age, income and wealth, geography, ethnicity, between college educated and those who aren't, for example. There's enormous spending on pressure on public spending, in particular healthcare spending that can't be easily switched off, and that's healthcare particularly, which is why you've seen the graphs I've shown. There are big fiscal and political choices and risks in different types of public spend and choices. If you ignore one group for too long, then of course you can get anger and public disquiet at the very least, or voter change. So politicians have to monitor this. And then finally, the current policy priorities in Britain appear to be on public spend, healthcare recovery, making sure that the NHS can recover and treat the backlog, something called levelling up, which means trying to address socioeconomic inequalities across the country, in particular newly voting Conservative areas, and of course the economy and managing the huge pile of debt that we've accrued, not least in the last 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And our last speaker is going to be looking a little bit at what solutions might be available. What can we do about the problems that have been identified, as well as what can we do to try and get a better understanding of what problems have been discussed, which may not be so difficult to manage. So I'm now going to hand over to Jane Gingrich from the University of Oxford, who's going to provide us with some ideas towards solutions. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you so much. I think my slides are part of the same pack that Scott had, if we can put those up. Thank you. I just have 2 slides, and I'll be really quite short because this is intended to sort of open the conversation maybe for the panelists, for the audience as well as we move on. So if we can just go to the next slide, actually hold for a second, I'll set this up and then go to the next slide. So what I had, what we heard from Jennifer just a moment ago and Scott at the beginning of the presentation is that a lot of the way that we sort of paradoxically think about sort of making old age healthy requires us really thinking about investing in the young. So we need people to enter old age in good health. And where there's high levels of inequality and deprivation, whether those are geographic or they're cross generations or cohorts, it can mean that as people enter old age, they're exiting the labor force younger, they're potentially entering in their 60s with more chronic conditions. And the key thing, and something we really argue in the book, is that thinking about healthy aging really requires thinking about what are the conditions politically that reduce inequality both across generations and then within them. Now, this raises the question of priorities. And so even if we have this idea that sort of investing in the young and investing in the old at the same time might be optimal, one of the critiques that we often hear is, well, you can't really do both. There's not money to do both. And that sort of takes 2 forms. One form is that there's sort of a lump sum budget. If you're going to give to one group, you must take away from another. And the other idea is that potentially we have to sort of spread things more across groups. It will sort of reduce the effectiveness of spending on each group. So what we want to do in the book, or what we did in the book, was to first say, well, is that really true? Is it true that you can't do both? And so I'll explain these 2 slides that we have up here. So the left-hand side of this slide shows the ratio of spending across countries on social benefits, excluding both health and education. So we take we take healthcare out, but we're looking at other forms of social programs. So for younger people, that would include things like unemployment benefits, housing benefits, income supports, childcare, and so on. And benefits that are primarily for older people, it would include things like pensions, survivors benefits, and disability benefits that largely go to older citizens. And this comes out of some early work that Julie Lynch, one of the co-authors, did, which has been updated to the more recent data. And what you do is, if you look at the ratio of spending on the elderly to spending on young people, which is, you can see that some countries like Greece, Japan, Italy spend a lot more in terms of social benefits on the elderly relative to the young. And there's other countries down here, which include the UK, but also Norway, Netherlands, Sweden, Ireland, that actually spend more evenly on the two groups. So it is possible, if we look across countries, to sort of spend on both groups. It's not, we actually see many countries combine expenditure on both groups quite effectively. So that raises the question, well, if you target one group, does it mean there's sort of less for everyone? Does it reduce the sort of total spending size? And again, we can see that that's not entirely true. So this chart sort of maps on the x-axis, the non-elderly spending as a percentage of GDP, and on the y-axis, the elderly spending as a percentage of GDP. And what we can see is that there's plenty of countries that are actually effectively spending on both groups. And if we did this actually with poverty among the two groups, which we look at in the book as well, we'd see something quite similar, which is that there's countries that have been quite effective at reducing poverty or inequality among both the old and the young at the same time. So we know kind of empirically that there's not necessarily a necessary trade-off between policies that are effective for both groups, so that there is a sort of possible set of political coalitions that can produce them. So can we go to the next slide, please? And so the question then is sort of, how do we get there? And that is the big question. So what we try and do in the book is sort of think about some of the ways that we can do what we call kind of a high road coalition, in which we're thinking about what are the political conditions for investing across the life course. And one of the challenges that comes out of some of the sort of academic literature is that the idea that sort of investing in the young is often viewed as kind of a future-oriented investment, and politicians are often quite struggle with things that sort of pay off in the future. But what we argue is that actually future-oriented investments can be made in the present when we think about the underlying coalitions behind them. And there's sort of three things that I want to kind of think about in terms of solutions. So the first is one of the most effective mechanisms that we see when we look cross-nationally at creating these coalitions of the young and the old together is when policymakers take seriously some of the issues around gender in the family. So the family is the home of multiple generations who often share interests, and policies that have looked to sort of expand the well-being of women as workers or to support gender equity often have the beneficial effect of providing resources that both facilitate care for the young and facilitate work and labor force participation among the working age, and can help support older people who need social care. So thinking about sort of making concrete a future-oriented investment in the present, one possible way to think about that is to think about things that support gender equity. A second thing is to think about policies that address inequalities that are not age targeted. So when subsidies are provided that are primarily targeted at one group to address inequality, for instance, subsidies for the elderly, for fuel costs, and so on, that might not be as effective as thinking about policies that are not generationally targeted. And that seems like an obvious point, but it's one that's really important to sort of keep in mind when we're thinking about these policies that can really build coalitions. And the third point is to think about the credibility of policies. And so this really came out in Jennifer's presentation just a moment ago when she was talking about national insurance raises. When young people or older people think that they're likely to bear the costs of a policy adjustment in the future, then the policy becomes less credible and they become less supportive. When we can spread some of those costs out where we have to cut or engage in kind of more austerity, under those circumstances, those can be done in ways that don't sort of target one age group or that particularly don't put the costs on low-income people, then it creates more credibility amongst these groups that in the future policies will benefit them. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Now, some of the discussion perhaps can focus on the extent to which there are any serious issues that we're dealing with here. Will the costs of care rise rapidly? And most of the evidence suggests that it will rise only slowly, but we can come back to that. There's also, coming from the different presentations, a number of themes that I think are of some interest. And one of them is the extent to which it is, in fact, the case that the elderly are a coalition, a group of people who will vote in a consistent way for their own self-interest, or the extent to which they will take a broader view and possibly be much more diverse in what they do. But Erica has been collecting the questions, so perhaps you could provide us with one or two of the themes for discussion now, Erica.
Yes, some quite hard questions for you, I'm afraid, but I know you're not afraid of that. So one of them is really, it's about the political choices that are available. So if resources are scarce, even if they're scarce because of political reasons, how should we ration welfare? How do we make those decisions? Who do we prioritize? And, you know, is there any indication that younger people will vote for higher pensions and things like this out of self-interest because they too will be older one day? And this is one for Jennifer, which is how much is the current state of health due to the sort of neoliberal policies of the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher? And is there anything that we should be looking at there? But hopefully we'll have time for a second round. Thank you.
Okay, perhaps then, Scott, would you like to start us on the how do we make the choices? Who should we prioritize?
So we didn't play this too heavily because we're focused on the politics, but we argued for a life course approach, which essentially involves thinking temporally over somebody's life. And what that means is that instead of saying, who should we prioritize generation to generation, what should we prioritize? For example, a lot of the problem is chronic conditions. A lot of the problem is people acquiring chronic conditions earlier in life. A lot of the problem is mismanagement of chronic conditions through middle and older age. That suggests think about chronic conditions and primary care responses to those, for example, and prevention, instead of saying that we're going to become concerned about older people 40 years after they first got diabetes or whatever the problem is. So don't think about who to prioritize, think about what to prioritize from a policy perspective. And you can often find the supportive coalitions for that by thinking outward from the good policies.
So Jane, do you want to add anything on that? Yeah, okay. Okay, I mean, I think there's something very interesting there, that if you actually start looking at a problem rather than looking at an age group, you come to a very different sort of perspective. And we do know from other work that health promotion, even amongst older people, can be very effective in preventing not only the further development of chronic diseases, but preventing also the those chronic diseases getting worse. So we do have some evidence that a life course approach can be useful. Jennifer, you were given a very easy question there. Perhaps you could just give us the quick and succinct answer there.
Thank you for that. Well, we know that economic inequality leads to greater health differences, a bigger health gap between rich and poor. So we know that. And obviously the 80s were a massive time with economic liberalisation, weren't they, neoliberal? But we also know more, I know more actually about the period since 2010, where of course austerity, regardless of neoliberal policies or not, austerity cutbacks have had a direct impact on inequality. And actually it's probably one of the reasons, not the only reason, why health has, life expectancy has stalled in the UK and the US far greater than most other OECD countries, with the exception of Iceland, actually. I think it's Iceland and the US are worse than the UK for some bizarre reason. But life expectancy stalled across most developed countries in that time. Not all of them had austerity, so austerity, I think, made it worse. We're still getting to grips with what is causing the stalling life expectancy we're seeing and the big gaps between rich and poor in Britain. Obviously, wealth and poverty is one factor. And we also know that there's some parts of the country which have a lot of what's called deaths of despair. Some of you will have read the Angus Deaton and Anne Case book. And these are particularly young people of young working age population where their health is deteriorating faster than everywhere else, particularly younger men who are dying of substance abuse, violent deaths, suicides, drug, that type of thing, particularly in the Northeast, Northwest and the West Midlands. And we're not addressing that. It's sort of policy, it's hopelessness in a sense. So it's a combination of inequality and hopelessness, I think, are the toxic combination, injuring health.
Thanks, Jennifer. Erica, do we have another round of questions?
I suppose there's one question which we can just squeeze in under the wire, which is about whether or not population aging is actually something that's going to slow down, and how do we factor in these kinds of demographic changes into policy making? And I would like to add, seeing as I'm asking the question, how do we factor in issues like migration as well?
Okay, perhaps Scott, do you want to start us on this, and then we'll go round?
In a lot of cases, it's hard to say exactly what demographics will do politically, because how people vote at different ages involves their assets, their wealth, their income, their health, their education, their race. So there's no one Europe-wide answer for how people vote at different ages. But broadly, the leveling off of the older share of the population means that even if you believe that there's a significant strain on health systems now from an aging society, well, it will go away. And even in the teeth of that, we're still managing to modify most welfare states towards being more invested in people at a younger age. Immigration. So you are not going to change the demographics of Europe significantly under any conceivable regulatory regime European countries are going to adopt. But I would point out that immigration status is one of the biggest inequalities we see in aging societies, because that's where we get the cheap caring workforce. And on one hand, if you say we want a professionalized and better paid caring workforce, you are doing immigrant integration as well as looking after older people better. But equally, your immigration can frequently be a replacement for your elder care policy. And I think in a lot of the most unequal countries, Italy, United Kingdom, Spain, you're seeing the use of immigration policy, legal and illegal, as a replacement for a sensible policy on social care.
Yeah, can I add?
Oh, sorry, Jennifer, you come next then.
Just to add to that, I mean, obviously because of Brexit, we have less access to labour markets. And we are finding that there is an increase in growth of people in Britain who are economically inactive. There's 400,000 of those in the country. And we also find that many people in certain parts of the country are of working age are not working because they have chronic disease. And that is the single biggest factor leading to economic inactivity. So a combination of lower migration plus increase in chronic disease occurring earlier in the working age population means that politicians at some point are going to have to be focused on boosting the labour force market through investment in people's health. At the moment, it's translating into health care spending. It's not translating into public health spending or action on the wider determinants of health, which is where I think they need to be going if it's a long-term cutting off of immigration.
Okay. Jane, any additional points?
Yeah, just sorry, my internet cut out for a moment, which is why I didn't reply to the previous question. So I'll kind of loop in the two answers to this question with also the question that came up before, which is, okay, how do we get the young more opted in to some extent in the long run? And I think that what we can see is when you look at both young people and older people, and you just look at sort of basic attitudes towards the state, that most people are fairly redistributive. Most people do have actually quite a strong preference for some degree of social solidarity. And the key thing when we're thinking about policies moving forward is sort of how to build on some of those, I think, more pro-social beliefs and behaviors that actually exist across generations, rather than sort of cutting them off. And so where policies really divide people by age groups, or where policies really draw hard lines around people by migration status, it can sort of solidify some of these inequalities in ways that also perpetuate the politics in the next round. So if you look at the sort of basic attitudes of young people towards some of the tax and spend in Britain, they're negative towards some of it, but actually there's been a real rebound in youth attitudes on a lot of dimensions towards support for overall equality and certain kinds of, benefit structures that would be more equalizing in the long run. So I think there's many ways in which policy can sort of build or encourage forms of solidarity. And the key thing to think about is sort of how to not close that off in the design of those policies. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think one of the things we can see from all these discussions is that these issues are in fact very complicated. People are aging in complicated ways. Their needs are changing in complicated ways. I mean, one point that was brought up was, I think Jennifer brought it up, was that with people dying at older age, particularly men dying at older age, we have more viable couples proportionally than we used to have. And that means so long as one or other of them is able to do each of the tasks you need, you get viable households, which switches the need for support from being need to care for people in total to need to support carers to allow them to contribute to the caring process. And equally, we know that a lot of the care costs come near the end of life. And we see in some countries, the numbers of people approaching the end of life is increasing rapidly as the baby boomers have come through. So we understand this is very complicated, but I think one of the interesting things is if we start looking at the problems as problems rather than the problems as people, we may come to much more coherent discussion. So I'd just like to thank our speakers today and the people who have managed the webinar for us today. And sorry, we didn't have contributions from Julie on this, but I think Scott did a remarkably good job in pretending he was as good as Julie. So thank you for doing that. And thank you all for attending. And we hope you found something of interest in this discussion today. Goodbye then, and thanks again.